Today we're throwing it back to take a look at 10 different ways that you can make a lantern. For this first one, we're going all the way back to 2021, so ignore some of the sound and video quality of this one, but it is one of my all-time favorite lanterns. In fact, my mom loved it so much that I gave it to her and she still has it in her home today. So we're going to be making a lantern here, and I am starting out with some of these shadow boxes from Dollar Tree. So I have a small one, I have a medium-sized one, and then I have two larger ones, and I'm just gonna take off any embellishments that they have, try to sand it down and get it as smooth as I possibly can to get ready to paint. And at first I started sanding this bunny one to get the glitter off, and then I was like, oh wait, just rip the paper off, it comes right off so easily. And then I thought I recorded when I was painting these, but clearly I didn't. Anyways, I just painted them in Mineral by Waverly, and I'm sure you all know how to paint. So next I had this bag full of shims that my husband had in the garage, and because they're smaller on one side, thicker on another, I had to glue them together so that I would have one solid piece that was the same width the entire way down. But if you had paint stir sticks or just scrap wood or anything, I did have scrap wood, honestly I didn't feel like cutting it down, I thought these would be easier, but you could do that and completely skip this step. So once the wood glue had dried, I just took some wood filler, filled in all of those cracks so that these would look like one solid piece, and then just sanded that down. Again, I painted all of these things with Mineral by Waverly. I love this taupey grayish color. It's so popular right now and I love the way it looks. But then I'm gonna take my shims and I'm gonna glue them in a 90-degree angle, and I'm gonna also put a bead of hot glue in the center to make sure these are nice and secure. So these are gonna be our corners of our lantern. Next, I'm going to hot glue these in all four corners. So you would need 8 stir sticks if that was what you were using, or 8 pieces of wood or whatever you were using for this. And I'm gonna glue these down to the top and the bottom. I don't know why I didn't paint part of these before putting them in. One of the videos that I had watched where I got my inspiration from, they didn't, so I thought maybe I shouldn't. I don't really know what the reason was. I think it was because of the glue holding things together. It was a little easier to hold together not painted, but anyways, it ended up just being an extra step that I needed to do in the end. I've seen so many of these lanterns, and I'm going to show you a few of my favorites that I've seen recently here in a minute. But after you have the top and bottom squares glued on, or boxes glued on, then you're going to take your medium-sized one, glue it on top right in the center. I just drew a line in the center so I knew where to glue it. Same thing with this smaller one. We're just going to stack them up on top of the lantern. I also do add a little finial on top, and I don't think I recorded that part either. But now I'm just going back in with my Waverly, painting up all of the outside parts that I did not originally paint. And then I thought it was looking a little plain. I was gonna leave it here, and then I was like, no, it kind of needs something else. So I took this assorted dowel rods that I have from Walmart, and I took the square ones because my lantern is a rectangle. It's more square than it is round. So I'm taking these square ones and I'm going to cut them down to fit on the top and the bottom of my lantern. And I put these about an inch up on both the top and bottom. First, I just cut them down with my miter shears. And like I said, I put these an inch from the top, an inch from the bottom, and I just drew a little line so I knew where the top of my dowel rod was gonna go. And I know my head keeps getting in the way here. I love this added detail. It definitely gave it a little something extra. I wanted to make one of those lanterns, those really large lanterns that you see at Hobby Lobby, but those things are $150. No thank you, I am not spending that. But here's a look at 3 of the most recent and ones that I've seen and that I really love, that I got inspiration from for this piece. And here's a look at how mine turned out. I absolutely love this. I think this is by far my favorite project on my channel. I just absolutely love the way this turned out. But let me know in the comments which one of these was your favorite, and I'll make sure to link all of the inspiration pieces below. Next up is a very unique looking lantern. This one is made out of fluted glass, and again, one of my favorites that I still have today. I love learning new techniques and bringing you guys along, so for this project, I'm going to be working with glass in a way I haven't done before. I found these 12 by 12 glass sheets at Hobby Lobby and thought the rib detail was such a modern look, but I need to cut the glass down to the size I want. This was super intimidating at first, but it's actually really easy to do. The tool I'm using to cut my glass is this pistol grip glass cutter, which has a tiny tungsten carbide wheel and the empty chamber where you put the glass cutting oil. I'm going to show you on a scrap piece of glass how this works and how easy it is. You place the wheel at the edge of your glass, push down but not too hard, let the cutter do the work, and glide across the surface. This is going to score the glass, and you want to hear that scratching sound. Then, to break the glass, you use these running pliers. They have a U shape which helps push on the glass, and this line which you line up with the score, and then gently squeeze the handles. You want to leave these rubber tips on them. I accidentally threw them away and had to go grab them out of the trash. Now it's time to cut the real piece. I was so nervous to do this since the glass was a lot thicker than my test piece, but there were two things I learned while doing this. One, I needed to cut the textured glass from the back or the smooth side. And two, you want to start at the top and pull the cutter towards you rather than roll it away from you. I don't think I said what I'm creating here. This is going to be a lantern, and I wanted to add just a small bit of detail to it. So I'm using the cotton and eucalyptus transfer, again from Dixie Belle. There was a piece that looked like it would fit a corner. That was perfect to take up one pane of glass and then slightly wrap around onto a second. The perfect amount of detail I was looking for. These transfers were a little difficult to get onto the glass. I really had to keep rubbing over and over on the same spots, and it was just staying on the backer, not releasing to the glass. I did put the transfer onto the smooth part of the glass. I knew the ridges would be way too difficult, and I wasn't confident in how that was going to turn out. After I finally got the transfer on, I can assemble the lantern. I used a combination of E6000 and Starbond super glue this time for the instant hold, since hot glue and glass are not friends. And for the corners, I added a dowel rod. My original plan was to add a little strap or something to the top, but after putting it together and seeing how large it is, I thought it needed a base. So looking around my craft room, I have another one of these nesting boxes from the Dollar Tree that was the perfect size. My lantern is not perfectly square, so the spacing around the sides is not even, but that's okay. I glued the glass onto the box with E6000, and that's it for this lantern. It is incredibly heavy, and I'm terrified it's going to break, but fingers crossed it holds up. This next lantern is super easy and made using one of the crafting community's favorite items, Jenga blocks. For this project, I'm taking 2 blocks and gluing them end to end and creating 8 sets like this. You'll see here there are 3 blocks, but I ended up changing that, and I also made 4 sets of 6 blocks glued end to end. So I'm making a lantern here and realized I made assembling it harder than it needed to be. I thought it would be easiest to put the 4 sides together first, so I took 2 of the 3 block pieces. I didn't cut the 3rd block off just yet, and glued 1 to each end of the 6 block piece. When I went to put the sides together, I realized the 3 blocks was just too long, so that's when I got out my miter box and cut 1 block off of each end. This looks much better, and I can now glue the pieces together. There's going to be a square in the center and the sections are not going to line up evenly. I glued one section to kind of the middle of the blocks for the section next to it. I hope that makes sense, but you'll see how it starts to come together. And I only glued the top together first, let that dry, and then glued the bottom. So I made this same lantern, but with the giant Jenga blocks from Five Below, and this time I glued the bottom together first, then added the sides, and flipped it over to add the top. And I think this way was a little easier to assemble in case you want to recreate this project. Back to the regular size blocks, I'm using one of these wood circles from Dollar Tree for the base of the lantern and filled in the hole with spackle, and then glued it down to the bottom of the lantern. At first I only used wood glue, but the blocks are not even, so I added a dab of hot glue as well. Then I stained the lantern with that same Valspar antiquing glaze, but I didn't love how that looked, so I ended up painting the blocks black and left the circle with the stain. And that's it for this one. I think it's such a cute lantern, and you can make this as small or as large as you want. This next lantern is a little bit unusual and made with a different type of material, so I'll let you be the judge on whether or not you think it was successful. For this project, I'm taking a Dollar Tree hula skirt and I'm going to remove some of the raffia from the jute cord. I probably ended up using a third to a half of this skirt for this project. I took 12 individual pieces and tied them together with a knot at one end and then taped it down to my table. I'm sure you can guess what I'm gonna do next. We're making a braid. I think I ended up making 4 or 5 braids just like this. Next, I'm making 9 more braids, but this time I'm adding in a wire inside of the braid. This is a 16 gauge wire. I thought about using the Dollar Tree floral wire, but wasn't sure if that would be sturdy enough. Once I had all of my braids, I'm going to bend the wired ones so they are straight on both ends, but the middle is curved. And I did that to all 9 pieces. Then I'm taking this cement base from a Dollar Tree decor piece and using my Starbond super glue to attach the wired braids to the cement piece. Now you can see there's some glue on the cement piece. I tried adding the braids before I bent them and that didn't work. They would just pop right off when I would start bending. So I took them all off, shaped them how I wanted, and now I'm gluing them back on. Now I need a top because this is going to be a lantern. So I grabbed a little wood circle that I have and glued the tops of the braids to the circle. I also have my mini level on top to make sure I glue these flat. After the tops are glued down, I snipped off the remaining braid. Next, I'm taking the braids that did not have wire in them and wrapping them around both the top and the bottom to cover up the ends. I wrapped the entire outside of the cement piece that was showing and also the top of the wood circle. You'll see there's a wood ring on top. I'm not sure where I was going with that, but it wasn't necessary. I just ended up covering it up with the braids. For the handle, I took another piece of the braid, glued it to the top like a loop, and then covered the ends with a half wood bead, and that's it for this one. This next style of lantern was floating around the craft community for quite a while, so I had to try it for myself, but it was quite a struggle for me, so let's check it out. I'm starting with 2 sets of these Dollar Tree racetracks from the toy aisle. Now, yes, I'm making a lantern, and I know this has been done before, but I love making lanterns and wanted to make one for myself. So I started out cutting off the ends where the hole is, and you guys, this project was a struggle, because I always want to do things different and the height of one racetrack was not tall enough for me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I wanted the racetrack to sit flush against the circle base, so I cut the sides off of the track bottom and repeated that for all 4 tracks. Then I'm gluing the tracks down to the wood base. Once I had all 4 tracks glued down, I cut them down a little on top to be the height I wanted. And here's where things just started to go downhill on this project. I still wanted that rounded top of the lantern like you typically see with these, but I have 4 separate pieces. So I had the bright idea to cut the side of the track off 2 of the pieces so they would slide into the second track pieces. That actually worked really well, and I glued them together with my super glue. I thought that would have a stronger hold, but it ended up peeling right off, plus the top was now more pointed than rounded. So back to the drawing board. I picked up another set of the racetracks and thought I would round the tops and then add a little extension to the bottom to make it taller. So that has to work, right? Kind of. I cut a little piece of the plastic to attach the back and join the 2 pieces together that way. Oh, you also want to sand the plastic pieces before adding the glue. That helps them adhere better. So I glue the tracks back onto the wood circle, and they're just bowing where the 2 tracks meet. So I'm thinking, great, now what? This plastic is just so thin, it is not holding up. Then I thought to grab my giant popsicle sticks and added those for stability. So finally, this thing is coming together. Look at that. Now that I have the base of this lantern built, I wanted to add some detail to the tracks using my IOD Regal Trimmings mold. I have been finding so many awesome ways to use this mold, it was well worth it. This week I'm using my DAS air dry clay, and I'm going through this part quickly, but I do have more in-depth air dry clay videos on my channel, and we'll link one below for you. One thing I love about these IOD trim molds is how you can continue the pattern. There is no need to cut anything. You can make a continuous chain however long you need it. So I covered all of the tracks with this design and set it aside to dry. Next, I painted the clay and track with my black chalk paint. I did not paint the circle base though, and I'm warning you now, there is a lot of painting in this video. On top of the lantern, I had this decorative glass lid, which came off a Dollar Tree jar, and you're gonna see that coming up in another project shortly, but I glued it on top with E6000 and then painted that black as well. And next, I wanted to add feet to the bottom and found this old wooden piece thrifting. I'm not sure what it was meant to be, but I pulled 4 of the circles off and glued them to the bottom. Then I stained the circle with dark walnut, and that's it for this guy. Style it to fit your home decor, and this could also stay out all year long. If you've been following me for a while, then you've seen my struggles with milk paint. So for this next lantern, it was my very first attempt at using this medium. Next, I'm taking this 2x2 and we're making a lantern. Again, this is not an original idea, but some of you may remember this lantern I made last year, and I had wanted to share an idea for Christmas with you on the way that I was decorating it. Unfortunately, that lantern did not hold up, so this time I'm making it out of wood. I cut down 4 pieces at 18 inches long and then 8 pieces at 5 inches long. Also, I cut 4 1-inch pieces, and that you'll see in a little bit. Now to build the lantern, I promise this is a really easy build. I'm taking 2 of the 18-inch pieces and 2 of the 5-inch pieces to make one of the sides. And to attach them, I'm using my wood glue, spreading it out with my finger over the surface to get the best adhesion, and then used my square to make sure the sides are flush before adding a brad nail for an immediate hold. Then it's just a matter of building on the rest of the sides. So I put 4 5-inch pieces on and then added the 2 18-inch pieces on top. Once I had the frame built, I need a top and a bottom. I used a scrap 1x12 and traced the lantern on it and cut that out, and then glued and nailed them in place. Here you can see the bottom is not quite flush with the sides, so I'm going to take a 60 grit sandpaper with my orbital sander to make sure all the edges are flush. This is going to make the lantern look more store-bought instead of handmade. And last, for the build portion, I'm adding these 1-inch pieces to be the tiny cute little feet. Next, I'm painting the lantern in sage. This is not going to be the final color, but instead it's an underlayer. I'm going to use milk paint on top. I've never used milk paint before and learned a few things during this process, which of course we'll get into. But milk paint is a powder that you mix with warm water to create the paint. And depending on how thick you want your paint, the ratio can vary, but typically you want 1 part paint to 1 part water. And when researching, everyone said to use lukewarm water, but I actually found a little hotter water to work better. You also don't want to mix more paint than what you're going to use. This paint does go bad quickly. I also found it was easier to mix it in a smaller container like a cup and use a plastic fork to mix it. You want to mix for about 2 minutes until that powder is dissolved, and then let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes to allow the paint to fully absorb into the water. This first batch was way too thick. My water was not warm enough to dissolve the powder, so I added more water, and then it was too thin. So this certainly is a Goldilocks medium that needs to be just right. And here's where the power went out again. But good news is I figured out how to mix the paint correctly and added 2 more coats. So milk paint is unpredictable and most people use it because they want to get a chippy look. Well, I did something wrong because the paint didn't chip at all whatsoever. You can see slight little cracks, but nothing like I was expecting. So I did some more research and learned if you want that chippy look, you need to apply the milk paint to a slick, non-porous surface, and chalk painted wood is the exact opposite. So we're back to square one. I repainted the lantern in sage, and this time I'm going to add petroleum jelly to select areas so the milk paint doesn't adhere. This time when I added the milk paint, it didn't stick at all to the areas with petroleum jelly. That also wasn't exactly what I wanted. At least we were getting a little bit closer to that chippy look though. Here you can see how the milk paint should react. There are peeling areas that are starting to flake off, and then you'd want to take sandpaper and knock off all that loose paint. If you want to stop the paint from continuing to chip, seal it after sanding, otherwise this piece is done. So even though it put me through hell, it turned out pretty cool. If you have any tips on working with milk paint, leave them in the comments below. I would love to keep playing around with it. Now, this next one you might not think of as a typical lantern, but I felt like it fit the theme, so let's take a look. For this project, I'm using a different kind of reed. This is also from Amazon and is much thinner. It reminds me more of edge banding than reed like I used for the basket. But anyways, I cut down 4 pieces at 34 inches each. Then I'm grabbing a thin wood circle. You can find these at any craft store, and I'm gonna attach the reed pieces to the circle. I used my staple gun to do this, knowing that the staples would go through that thin wood. So I put a piece of wood under the circle and held the piece being stapled over the edge a little bit. That way I didn't staple it to my craft table or into that wood block. And to push the staple edges down, I just used my hammer and they bent down super easily. Next, I'm taking the opposite end and stapled it down to the opposite side of the circle, and repeated this process with all 4 pieces of reed, spacing them out evenly. After I had all the pieces attached to the circle, I glued the top together so it would stay in place using super glue, and then stained everything in special walnut. So this is going to be a hanging lantern, and I found this plastic chain at Dollar Tree as part of their Halloween decor. To make it look a little more high-end though and less plastic, I took my antique wax and covered the rings with it. You could also use the garden chains from Dollar Tree for a bit of a more subtle look. You can see how the right side looks so much nicer. Since all the parts are very lightweight and kind of flimsy, I didn't want to set a candle directly onto the wood round, so I had this glass lantern lying around. You'll see how I attach it in a minute, but first I want to age it to match the rest of this project. This time I'm using my DIY dark wax to go over all of the gold. I even went around the edges of the glass for a more vintage look. Now you want to leave the wax on just like this and allow it to dry, otherwise it will wipe right off if you try to touch it. When the waxes were all dry, I'm attaching everything, and I used a metal binder ring painted in black and the antique Waverly wax. This was the best thing I could come up with, so the reed didn't just snap from the weight of the candle. So I put the ring around the reed center and through the handle of the glass lantern, and then attach the plastic chain to it as well. Now all the weight is on that binder ring, and I think this looks so good, and it was so easy to make. For this next lantern, this was Pinterest inspired and would definitely fit into that currently popular style of cottagecore. I've had this idea for over a year and just haven't done it yet. I got these chopping mats from the Dollar Tree and they are see-through. One side's kind of frosted looking and the other is shiny. I want to decoupage the mat, and I grabbed two options from my stash. One's a decoupage paper and the other is a basic tissue paper that was a little bit more colorful. Both options are stunning and very spring feeling, but I thought you could see the print and pattern a little bit better on the blue florals, so I went with that one. Since the decoupage paper wasn't as tall as the chopping mat, I had to cut it down a little bit. I used my X-Acto knife to cut it down, and it was really easy to cut through. Guess that wouldn't really make it a good chopping mat though. I then cut the mat in half because I'm making a little light box or a lantern, and it needs 4 sides. Next, I wiped down the surface of the mat. Since we're decoupaging the paper to the back, or the shiny side, I wanted to make sure there was no fingerprints or dust that got trapped and you would see them from the other side. I'm going to use my liquid patina to glue the paper onto the mat, but I actually think Mod Podge or decoupage glue would have been a little bit better for this project specifically. Decoupage paper is pretty thick, much thicker than when you use a napkin, and the liquid patina dries quickly. I used a fan brush to apply the glue so it would get up under the paper easily and apply the glue to all of the areas. I wasn't thinking when I did this first one, I had wanted to add both mats to the paper before cutting the paper down, but I had only added the one mat at first, so I had to cut this one down, but for the second paper, I added both mats and glued them at the same time. As the glue was drying, I realized I could see some streaks under the paper. It was like the areas that had more glue turned the paper more transparent, and the thinner glue areas stayed whiter. So I went back over top of the whole thing with a layer of the patina. I sanded off all the excess paper, and here's why I would have used a thicker glue like Mod Podge. You can see the paper peeling away from all the corners. I had to add more patina to make sure it stays down. Next, we need to build the lantern structure. I was able to create a rectangle with the Jenga blocks without having to cut down any of them again. Winning! I made 4 rectangles, and then before I added the decoupage mats, I want to paint them. I wanted the lantern to have a ton of texture, so I added baking soda to my paint, and I added a lot of baking soda. The way I like to get the most texture by using this method is by painting the first coat on how you normally would paint something. And then when you add the second coat, or however many coats you want after, you stipple it on. I love this technique. It is kind of hard to tell on camera here, but I'll make sure to get a close-up in the reveal. Once the paint was all dry, I'm adding decoupage mats onto the blocks with hot glue. The one thing you want to be cognizant of here is that you are gluing the frosted side down, so that's what you see on the outside of the lantern. That way you don't have the paper texture facing out. Next, I assembled the lantern and glued all four sides together. I realized after I put everything together, I needed a base for inside of the lantern because I'm gonna add some feet and I need something to put the light on. So I glued some blocks together. They don't fit perfectly on the bottom, but that's okay. You're not gonna see this part. I just painted them white as well, but not with the texture paint. It was a little difficult to get the blocks glued in. I had dry fitted it and it was pretty snug, so of course when I went to actually glue it in, one side didn't want to cooperate. But I left it as is. Like I said, you aren't going to see this part. And last, I grabbed these little feet that I have. I think these are from Hobby Lobby, and I glued them onto the base. I like how they looked being in a little bit from the edge. I just love how this project turned out. I think it is so stunning and even more so than I had envisioned. You would need some power tools for this next lantern. It is pretty involved, but it turned out so beautiful. This project is something you can leave out all year long. I bought this set of 6 chairs at the Goodwill bins a while back because I loved the variety of spindles on it. I want to use the 4 legs of this chair to create a lantern and use the spindles as the pillars. I've never seen anyone do this, but please let me know if you have because I thought it was such a great idea. And it's pretty easy to wiggle these chairs apart without damaging the spindles. The one downside is that you now have holes in the spindles where they were attached to the chair. So to fix that, I'm using a dowel to fill it in. Simply added wood glue to the hole, added in the dowel, and then used a thin flush cut saw to cut off the excess. The dowel size I had was a tiny bit too small for the hole, so then I used some wood filler to fill in the gaps. I think this particular wood filler was old or something because I didn't love how it was looking. I had added on 2 layers of this, letting it dry in between, and it would keep shrinking and not filling in this space entirely. So then I got out my joint compound and used that to fill in the rest of the gaps. This worked out much better. Next, I gave the spindles a scuff sand before painting them, just so the paint doesn't scratch right off of that slick surface. I also added a layer of Dixie Belle Slick Stick just for some added security. This is essentially a primer and very similar to the Zinsser 123 primer. Then I painted them in a grayish brown color called Prairie Gray. In the bottom, I'm using a scrap 1x12 board and cut it down into 2 10-inch by 10-inch square pieces. Since the spindles have so much detail, I want the top and the bottom to match that elegance and not just look like a basic piece of cut wood. Again, I've had these trim pieces left over from other projects in my stash. I'm going to use this beveled looking one around the bottom section. This is also going to conceal the bottoms of the spindles since they don't exactly cover the corners of the wood base. The trim is super easy to cut. You could use miter shears, but since I was already out in the garage, I decided to use the saw. Once I had the pieces cut down, I glued them down directly on top of the wood base. For the lantern, I wanted there to be a little bit more to it, so I cut down another 1x12 and made it an 8-inch square. This time I'm going to cut the same trim down and glue it directly around the side edges of the smaller wood square. And on the larger wood square, I'm using the spiral looking trim and that same beveled one stacked together. Except this time I'm flipping the beveled one upside down so the thin section is facing down. And this will mirror how I have it on the but because I'm a perfectionist, I'm going to fill in all of the seams with wood filler. This just helps to make your project look more high-end and store-bought. I'm going to stain the wood, so I made sure to wipe off any excess wood filler as soon as I applied it, since it does not take the stain the same way that the wood itself does. And then I stained all of the wood with early American. To add the spindles to the base. I started with the bottom and added them right into the corners of the wood base. I let that dry before adding the top because the spindles taper in and I want to make sure it's centered. Then I flipped the lantern upside down and glued the top of the spindles. You want to pay attention here to make sure the wood grain is facing the same direction on both the top and the bottom. All that's left to do is to decorate this guy up. Like I said at the beginning, you could use this all year round. I'm just decorating for Christmas since we're heading into that time of year. You got a little sneak peek of this lantern earlier in the video, and unfortunately it just didn't hold up, but I wanted to include it here at the end to show you that not everything that us DIYers create holds up. Next up, I have a giant lantern that I am building, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing is giant. So I stopped at the Dollar Tree and I grabbed 8 of these 11 by 14 inch frames, and I'm going to start out by removing the backs, removing the glass, and then also removing those little tabs that hold down your glass and your backer in place. Once I have everything removed, then I'm going to take my E6000 and I'm going to put this on a majority of the bottom part of my frame, and then I'm also going to add in a small little dab of hot glue on either end just to hold it in place for the short term while that E6000 has time to set up, and then I clamp it in place, allowing it to dry overnight. And then the next day I came back, I did that with all 8 of my frames. So I created 4 sides, and then the next day I came back and I'm going to start building the rectangle that is the shape of my lantern, again using my E6000 and then hot glue in the spaces where there is not E6000. You do not want to overlap the two. And then I'm just going to add in each of my frame sides to build out that rectangular shape lantern. And this time I had to use my little mini clamps. I love these things. I got them from Harbor Freight and they are just so cute, but I used those to hold everything together. Then once that was dry the next day, I am going to build a bottom for this. So I'm just using some foam core board. I traced out the bottom of my lantern. And when you're cutting foam core board, you do want to make sure you have a nice sharp X-Acto knife. I knew mine needed replaced, so I just decided to replace it before cutting out this piece. And then I'm going to cut out that square. Now I did realize I traced out the outside of my lantern, but I actually wanted it to fit inside of the lantern itself so that it was flush against the bottom of the frames. So I do go back in and trace that out the inside and then cut those edges down a little bit so that it's going to fit perfectly and everything is going to be nice and level against the ground. And once I have that figured out, I'm just going to hot glue my foam core base right to the bottom of my lantern. And now comes the messy and time-consuming part of this project. If you've been following me for a while, you know I'm still working through this giant 5-gallon tub of joint compound that I've had for months from my bathroom renovation. This is actually the last time I'm going to get to use it because it is starting to go bad and there's still probably half a container of that thing left. So note to self, don't ever buy a giant tub of joint compound that you don't need. But I just start covering the entire lantern all the way around the outside. And yes, I do love watching true crime while I'm crafting, so that's what's on my TV right now. But I'm not worrying about getting this nice and smooth. I actually want it to be very textured. That's the look that I'm going for with this project. Once I cover the entire outside, I let that dry overnight, and then I'm taking a sanding block and I'm just lightly going over it just to knock down any of those sharp edges. So I was trying to get a little glimpse of that on the underneath part here, where you can see it's just very lightly over top. I don't want to get rid of that texture. And then I'm going to do the same thing, repeating that process on the entire inside of my lantern, and then let that dry as well. Now we need to build a top for this thing, and I really didn't know what I was going to do for this, and I don't know that this is even going to hold up very well, but I took some dowel rods that I have. These are kind of a larger size than a variety pack that I have, and I'm going to cut them down to the height that I want them to be for how tall I want the top of my lantern. Once I have those cut down, I am taking them and adding to the corners of the inside top of my lantern, and I'm using my Star Bond glue to do this as a temporary hold. Now, I knew this wasn't going to work. I knew I needed to add the joint compound to hold those in place more. I didn't do that at first because I was honestly being lazy and didn't want to wait another day for joint compound to dry. In the end, I had to do that anyways, so I should have just done it from the beginning. But here you can see this was a few days later. I had to go back in and add that joint compound to make sure those dowels were going to stay in place. So for the inside of it, you can see I have a little top there. I ended up changing it. Actually, I wanted to show you how tall this thing was, and my dog is terrified of tape measures. I really try to get him to not be so scared of things. He is such a baby, so I make him sniff everything that he's terrified of before I use it, but he didn't care. He left anyways. But this thing is just under 3 feet tall. It is massive. Next, I'm going to take some of these bamboo skewers from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to start cutting them down because I want to add a little bit of detail to the sides of my lantern. I was going to do like the X that you see everywhere on lanterns and decided no, I wanted to do something a little bit different, give it a little bit more interest. So I decided to add a kind of a frame inside of this frame. So I added 2 horizontal pieces and then 2 vertical pieces that kind of overlapped on the corners so that it gave a nice visual interest to this piece. And then I cut all of those down, then hot glued them in place, and I did this all the way around my lantern. As I was saying before, there was a top to my lantern, which you kind of saw a peek of, but I ended up having to change that out because I used one of the wood shadow boxes from the Dollar Tree. That ended up being too heavy and was initially what broke my dowels and why I had to go back and replace them. So I ended up replacing it with foam core board, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. Once I am done adding all of my detail, I am taking this heirloom white spray paint and I'm going to give it a nice coat. I don't really worry about getting the dowels because I do want to paint those a different color. The reason I didn't add those on afterwards was because I didn't think the glue would then stick to my paint after I had done the spray paint. So now after my spray paint dried, I'm taking a sponge with the color Warm Buff from Apple Barrel, and I thought this would be the easiest way to cover and paint the dowels because they are round, and this actually worked out really nicely. And I was able to, I had to put a couple of coats because it is an acrylic paint, but it worked out really well using this sponge, and I just covered all of my dowels in this color. Now we can finally make the top out of our foam core board. So I just took that shadow box from the Dollar Tree. I traced out the bottom of it to have my square base, and then I'm measuring out the sides to cut those down out of the foam board as well. I wanted this to be about the same size as that original box. So then I'm going to take my sides that I cut out and I'm going to glue them, attaching them to the square to create that same shadow box look. The one I created out of foam core board did end up being slightly bigger than the original just based on how I attached those sides, but I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and it looks very similar, just weighs a lot less. Next, I took some 8mm beads and I'm going to line the entire top to cover up those seams. And lastly, I am just taking this Dollar Tree faux leather ribbon. It is in like the gold kind of champagne color, and I'm cutting out 2 strips because I want to glue them together so that you don't see that white underside when I attach this as the handle of my lantern. And then I did take some gold paint just to go over the edges where I had glued it because you could still kind of see that white. But once I had finished that, I'm just going to hot glue it to the top of my lantern. I added that foam core board shadow box on top as well, just with some hot glue, and that was it for this project. So let me know what you think of it. I actually have a fun way I want to display this for Christmas, so stay tuned. I will share that in an upcoming video. That was actually the whole reason why I created this lantern in the first place, but since I had done it now, I wanted to share it a little early. At the very least, it definitely needs some more fairy lights. I never did get to decorate this one for Christmas, and I still want to give that a try someday so that I can show you how I had wanted to decorate it. But I hope you got some inspiration on the many different ways that you can create a lantern, and I'll see you in the next one.